Welcome to our new video series, Image Critic. What I will try in this critic series is give you some hints and ideas what you could possibly change in your images. That doesn't necessarily mean my way is better. Photography is always a question of taste, but it often helps to get a different point of view. So whenever you're able to get critique from somebody else, no matter if an experienced photographer or people who never even held a camera, listen and don't take it personal. If it hurts, forget about it for a day or two and then reconsider. Maybe there is some truth in it. In the end, we have to like our own pics, but having others like them somehow makes us happy too. So asking people for honest critique and listening is the only way to learn about the preference of the majority out there, and then you can decide whether you want to please others too or just yourself. Okay, here we go. Our first image was submitted by April Ashen. The tech specs are 1/125th of a second shutter speed, f8 aperture and ISO 400. Shot on a Canon T7i or 800D in Europe and 104mm focal length. The settings are spot on for my taste. The 1/125th of a second will avoid camera shake, particularly with this lens having a built-in stabilizer. But if you have used a tripod, I would have gone for a slower shutter speed to get the ISO down to 100, which is what I always try to do. When I start nitpicking, you see some slight noise in this area here. Nothing that really matters though. What I really like about the shot in the first place is that you actually saw that building. Beauty is everywhere. We just need to open our eyes, and you did that. You can practice photography without even having a camera in your hand, for example, on your way to work. Have a look around and check for things that would be worth photographing. You will be surprised of how many things are beautiful at second sight. I also like that you left some empty space here and that this edge of the house is very close to the golden ratio, which is an ancient ratio not only found in Greek architecture, but even in nature, like in the Nautilus shell, which is pretty remarkable. The golden ratio is 1:1.618, which means that this part of the image is 1 and this part is 1.618 times larger. For me, the golden ratio is more pleasing to the eye than using the rule of thirds, which would be 1/3 of the frame here and 2/3 on the other side. Talking about ratios, what I don't like that much is the aspect ratio. DSLRs in general output an aspect ratio of 2:3, so most of your images are probably 2:3. Your crop doesn't stick to that ratio, so if you want to create, for example, prints, some prints will have a shorter length than others and would be pretty awkward to hold. And with slideshows, the black frame from one image to the next will not always stay constant. I'm a very visual person and I don't like that. I try to keep the original aspect ratio of my images whenever possible. So in this case, I would have cropped it more like that. I hope that makes sense, but that of course is more personal preference than criticism and highly subjective. That's about it for criticism. I really like the shot. If I were to experiment a bit, I would have stepped a bit to the left to get the back of the window centered in the front window. And since you used the 125mm lens, I would have zoomed in all the way and maybe get a portrait shot only. But maybe you did that anyway. Our next image is from Darlin, a great shot from Hawaii. Let's first have a look at the camera settings. 1/180th of a second shutter speed, f16 aperture and ISO 100, shot on a Sony a7R II with a 20mm f1.4 lens. ISO 100 of course is perfect, f16 is a little much. Reason being is that first of all, there is no real foreground. The mountains in this area here and here are very far away and would easily be in focus if you would have chosen a lower f number. So the goal would be to have the best possible sharpness, and that's usually around f8 to f11 depending on the lens. Knowing Charles, he might have done some test shots and found out that this is the sharpest setting, but usually it is not. Composition-wise, I think it's really spot on. The waterfall clearly is the main focus, not only due to it being the brightest subject in the frame, it is placed out of center, which I like, and it's falling to the right of the frame, which is one of the major composition guidelines, leaving more space in the direction the subject is moving or facing, rather than on the opposite side. Depending on the landscape here, I might have tilted the camera up a bit to show the mountains and placed the lower edge of the frame somewhere here. But that's always hard to say when you don't see the scene on location. Editing-wise, it has just a tad too much contrast for my taste. I like it when waterfalls are white, but this area here is just a bit too white, so I might have dialed that down a bit. Also, the very dark areas here and there are just a tiny bit too dark for my taste, but that's subjective. It definitely looks very dramatic, and I love that. The third image of today's image critic session is from Joe Matthews. Camera settings are 1/800th of a second shutter speed, f10 aperture and ISO 100, shot on a Nikon D3500 at 300mm focal length. Tech specs are perfect, f10 is right where most lenses have the best overall sharpness, and there isn't all that much to critic here. Let's start with what I like. The silhouette backlit look. Exposing it brighter would have led to these areas being completely blown out. I also like that the reflection of the sun is out of center. That is a thing that users get drawn to most because bright parts of an image draw the attention. One mistake many people make is not checking their horizon when shooting. Particularly with lakes and the sea, you can easily tell when the horizon is off. Here's a quick tip to avoid that. In most cameras, you can display grid lines in the viewfinder that will help you keep the horizon level. Some cameras even allow a digital bubble level, but those aren't all that exact, so the grids are more accurate. So what I would do to this image is just straighten the horizon. The fourth and last image of this week's critic session is from Rebecca Rosen. Please excuse if the pronunciation of your name is off, I'm deeply sorry. Tech specs are 1/3200th of a second shutter speed, f7.1 aperture and ISO 640, shot on a Nikon D5600 at 18mm. Let's start with the tech specs. I like the brightness of the shot and the beautiful smooth lighting. I'm afraid the ISO is pretty high for an outdoor shot in good lighting conditions. So let's have a look at how we could get that down to ISO 100 without any issues and get the best possible image quality. You can see a lot of noise with that high ISO settings on newer cameras. One reason is when you're shooting JPEG, the camera adds a lot of noise reduction, but that makes the image softer in general, so we want to avoid that if we can. The shutter speed of 1/3200th of a second is one that you would use for something that is moving very fast, and if you want to freeze the motion. It doesn't hurt your image, but you don't need it that high. Since there is nothing moving in this shot, you could have chosen a much slower shutter speed. Even 1/200th of a second would be more than enough, so if you choose 1/200th of a second, you will gain a lot of light. With that light, you could lower your ISO to 100 and raise your f number from f7.1 to f11, and the image would still have the very same brightness. Now, if that was too much to digest, please have a look at our exposure bars. I'll give you a link in the description. The nice side effect, f11 would have made the lavender in the foreground much sharper too. On to composition. I like the low perspective and that the image has more than one layer. The lavender in the foreground, the house in the midground, and the hills in the background. As mentioned with other images, I also like that the main focus of the image, this part of the building, is not dead center, and that there again is almost the golden ratio of building versus background. The only thing I don't really like is the lantern here. My eyes constantly keep going there and back to the building. You might have been able to avoid it by panning right, but then you would have lost the golden ratio. You could have stepped left and panned back, but then you would have lost the lavender. So sometimes you have to live with what you get. One thing you could do is getting rid of the lantern by editing it out, but that would change in reality, and not everyone would appreciate that. However, here is a quick edit. I use my lasso tool to create a selection, and then I've created a Photoshop action for content-aware fill. I just have to press one button and the lantern is gone. So much for our first image critic session. Let me know how you like it and if it is helpful. And if you want to submit your own images for the next session, please send them at full resolution to submission@photo1by1.com. If it is too big for email, I suggest using WeTransfer.com, which is free and super easy to use because you don't even have to register. One important note: if your image contains recognizable people, like for example in portraits, please confirm in your email that your models are okay with your images being published on YouTube.